At my divorce hearing, my wife looked proud. That's the part I can't forget. Not angry, not sad, proud, like she'd already won something and was just waiting for the room to catch up. "You'll never see my kids again," she said. Not to the judge, to me. Quiet, so the judge wouldn't catch the tone, loud enough that I would. Her lover was sitting in the second row, in a suit that cost more than my truck, and he smirked and said, just under his breath, "That's right, sweetheart." And her mother, sitting next to him, folded her hands in her lap and gave me a small satisfied smile and said, "He doesn't deserve to hear them call him Dad." And then I heard the smallest voice in the world. My son, Micah, who is 6, was sitting on the bench beside his sister where the court had let them wait, and he had heard all of it. Every word, because children always hear the words you think are going over their heads. And his eyes filled up with tears, and he looked at me across that courtroom and he whispered, "Daddy, did you stop loving us?" I want to stop right here, 10 seconds into this, because I need you to understand what that question did to me and why it is the center of everything I'm about to tell you. My little boy did not ask me if I still loved him. He asked me if I had stopped, because somewhere in the months I'd been gone, somebody had taught him that I had. Somebody had sat my 6-year-old down and explained to him, patiently, that his father didn't love him anymore. And he had believed it, because he was 6, and because the person who told him was his mother. I didn't answer him in that courtroom. That's the thing people find hard to understand. My son asked me, out loud, in front of everyone, if I'd stopped loving him, and I sat there and said nothing. Not because I didn't have an answer, because the answer was so big it wouldn't fit in a whisper across a courtroom, and because if I'd opened my mouth I'd have come apart completely, and a father coming apart is not what a scared 6-year-old needs to see. So I just looked at him, and I tried to put a whole year of "I never stopped" into my face, and I held on, and I waited, because I knew, I was the only one in that room who knew, what was about to come out of that envelope. That is what was actually on trial that day. Not custody, not money. Whether my own children believed their father had stopped loving them. So before I tell you what was in the envelope the judge opened, the one that made my wife's proud face fall apart. And before I tell you what my son knows now, if you have ever had someone lie about you to the people you love most, and had to watch those people believe it, then stay with me, and go ahead and subscribe, because this is a story about a lie that almost worked, and the paper trail that undid it. Okay, let me back up. You need to understand why I wasn't there. My name is Wes Corrigan. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a welder and rigger, and about 2 years ago I made the decision that broke my family apart, and I thought at the time was the responsible thing to do. I took a contract overseas. Here's how that happened. Corinne and I had gotten ourselves into a hole. Not a dramatic one, just the ordinary American kind, where the car needs a transmission the same month the roof starts leaking, and the credit cards fill up quietly behind your back, until one day you're paying interest on interest and going backward no matter how many hours you work. We had 2 kids, Sadie and Micah, and I was watching us sink, slowly, and I hated it. And then a job came up through a guy I knew, rigging work on a big industrial project overseas, the kind of contract that pays a welder 3 or 4 times what he makes at home, because nobody wants to go and the conditions are hard. 9 months, then home. I took it, but not lightly, and I want you to see the night I decided, because it's the night my wife would later stand in a courtroom and turn inside out. I'd printed the offer, and I put it on the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, and Corinne and I sat there under the one light over the table and did the math together on a napkin. 9 months away. The debt gone. A clean start. I remember I said the hard part out loud, that 9 months was a long time to miss, that Micah was so little, and Corinne reached across the table and put her hand over mine and told me I was doing it for them, that she'd hold everything, together at home, that we'd get through it. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife, and we were making a sacrifice together the way families do. That is the moment I keep coming back to. Because a year later she would swear under oath that I abandoned them, and I would remember her hand on mine at that table, telling me to go. She agreed. We decided it together. I did not abandon my family. I got on a plane to dig them out. I want to tell you about the man I was when I got on that plane, because it's the version of me my kids weren't allowed to remember. I coached Sadie's soccer team. I did the bedtime routine every night I was home. The same 3 books. Micah always picked the same 3 books. I was not a perfect husband. Corinne and I had gotten distant in the way tired married people do, but I loved those kids like breathing, and they knew it. And when I left for the airport, Micah cried and held onto my leg, and I promised him I'd call every single day, and I meant it, and I kept it. For a while. I want you to see where I was calling from, because my kids never got to picture it. The project was in a desert, a construction site the size of a small city, and I shared a metal container dormitory with 5 other men from 5 other countries. The work was 12-hour shifts in heat that made the steel too hot to touch with a bare hand by 10 in the morning. And every night, no matter how wrecked I was, I'd walk out past the edge of the camp to where you could get 1 bar of signal, and I'd sit on an overturned bucket in the dark and call home. Because back in our town it was afternoon and the kids were getting out of school. For the first couple of months, Sadie would tell me about her day, and Micah would breathe into the phone the way little kids do and refuse to say anything and then not want to hang up. I lived on those calls. They were the whole reason the heat was worth it. And then one week, the calls just started ringing out. Then, going straight to voicemail, I'd sit on that bucket in the dark and listen to my own wife's recorded voice and leave a message and picture the phone buzzing on the kitchen counter at home while my kids ate dinner 10 feet away and never heard it. I told myself the signal was bad. I told myself a lot of things, on that bucket, in that dark. Because here is what I didn't know was happening back home while I was on the other side of the world, welding in brutal heat and calling my kids every night. Corinne had met someone. His name was Blaine, and he had money. Real money, the family kind, and somewhere in those first months I was gone, my marriage ended without anyone telling me, and Corinne made a decision of her own. She decided that the cleanest way to the life she now wanted was not to divorce the father of her children and share them. It was to erase him, and she had the perfect tool to do it. Distance. I was 10,000 miles away and gone for months, and a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old have no concept of 10,000 miles. All they know is that Daddy isn't here, and a child will accept almost any explanation an adult gives them for a thing they can feel but can't understand. So Corinne gave them one. She told them I left. Not that I was working, not that I was coming back. She told my children, over those months in 100 small conversations, that Daddy had chosen to go away, that Daddy was busy with his new life. And then, as it went on, worse things. That Daddy didn't call because Daddy didn't want to talk to them. That if Daddy loved them, he'd be here. She took my absence, the absence I'd chosen out of love for them, and she rebuilt it in their minds into the opposite, into proof that I'd stopped caring, and then she made sure the facts couldn't argue with her, because the facts would have. I did call, so she stopped answering. My calls started going straight to voicemail every night, and the voicemails I left, hundreds of them, please put the kids on, I miss them, tell them I love them, the kids never heard a single one. I wrote letters, actual letters, because I'm old-fashioned and I thought a thing a kid can hold might matter. I wrote Sadie and Micah a letter every week for months. I mailed them home. And months later, at that hearing, I would find out what happened to every one of them. But I didn't know any of that yet. From 10,000 miles away, all I knew was that my family was going quiet on me. And I told myself it was the time difference, the bad connection, Corinne being busy, the kids being kids. I told myself the story that let me keep working, the same way she was telling them the story that let her erase me. And by the time the job ended and I flew home, 9 months after I'd left, with the debt paid off exactly like I'd promised, I landed to a locked house, a wife who'd moved in with another man, and 2 children who flinched when they saw me. That was the homecoming. I'd flown 30 hours with a duffel bag and a folder of paid-off account statements I was so proud of, rehearsing on the plane how I'd fan them out on the kitchen table and tell Corinne we were free. We'd done it. We could start over. I took a taxi from the airport straight to our house, and my key didn't work, and the porch had furniture on it I didn't recognize. A neighbor came out and told me, gently, the way people tell you a thing they assume you already know, that Corinne and the kids had moved months ago. She gave me an address across town, a good part of town, and I drove there with my stomach in my throat, and it was the kind of house a welder doesn't buy. And Corinne opened the door of it, and behind her in the hallway I saw my daughter freeze at the sight of me, and my son duck behind the legs of a man I'd never met, and I understood the whole shape of my life in about 4 seconds standing on that doorstep. And Corinne looked at me, calm, almost sorry for me, and she said, "They don't want to see you, Wes. You did this. You left them." And she closed the door in my face, and I stood on the step of another man's house listening to my own children on the other side of it. Let me tell you about the months between that closed door and that courtroom, because they were the worst of my life, and because they're where I made the one decision that saved everything, though I didn't know it at the time. I could have fallen apart. Part of me did, but I had come home to 2 kids who believed I'd abandoned them, and there was only one thing in the whole world I cared about anymore, which was making that not true in their minds. So I got a lawyer I couldn't really afford, and I started fighting for the right to simply see my own children. Not full custody, not at first, just the right to be in a room with them. And Corinne fought me on every inch of it. And this is the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. She didn't just fight me in court. She kept working on the kids. Every visit I finally won through a judge, she'd poison in advance. Sadie would show up to our 2 supervised hours, already closed like a fist, telling me her mom said I was only there because the court made me. Micah would ask me, in that small, careful voice, whether it was true that I had a new family now and didn't want them. Someone had told a 6-year-old he'd been replaced. I would spend the whole 2 hours just trying to convince my own son that I wanted to be there, and then time would run out, and he'd go back, and the next visit we'd start again from 0, because whatever ground I gained, she'd take back during the week. I was fighting a war for my children's hearts, and she controlled the territory the other 6 days. And I want to be honest about what that year did to me, because I think there are men out there living in it right now, and I don't want them to feel alone in it. I lived in a rented room with a folding chair and a mattress and that box of letters, and I worked all day and I spent my nights building the least romantic thing in the world, a record, screenshots of canceled visits, a spreadsheet, God help me, a spreadsheet of every call and whether it connected. My lawyer had told me the court runs on evidence, not feelings, and that a father who says, "She turned my kids against me," is a dime a dozen, but a father who can show it with dates is something else. So every night I sat in that folding chair and documented the worst thing that had ever happened to me, calmly, like a clerk, because it was the only weapon nobody could take off me. There were nights it felt insane, like I was building a case no one would ever read while my kids forgot me in real time across town. I did it anyway. If you're in it, do it anyway. I learned to fight it in inches. I couldn't out-talk what she was doing, so I stopped trying to argue and I just started being the same, every single visit, no matter what mood they arrived in. Same silly handshake. I'd always done with Micah, offered every time even when he wouldn't take it. Same question for Sadie about her drawings, even when she rolled her eyes. I figured if she was rewriting who I was during the week, the only counter I had was to be relentlessly, unmistakably the actual me on the days I got, to let the real thing wear a groove next to the lie. It was the slowest work I've ever done. But there was a day, maybe the 4th or 5th visit, when Micah walked in and without thinking about it stuck his little hand out for the handshake before he remembered he wasn't supposed to, and we did the whole silly thing, the slap and the fist bump and the explosion, and he laughed the real laugh. And it was 3 seconds long, and I held on to those 3 seconds for weeks. That's what she was trying to take. 3-second laughs. That's the whole war when your kids are that small. There was one visit I'll never get out of my head. A supervised 2 hours at a family center, a beige room with donated toys, and a woman in the corner taking notes. Micah wouldn't come near me at first. He sat on the far side of that room and built a tower out of blocks with his back half turned to me, and I sat on the floor a few feet away and just talked, quiet, about nothing, about the tower, the way you'd coax a scared animal. And after about 40 minutes he'd drifted close enough that when his tower fell he looked at me, before he remembered not to, and for 1 second his face lit up the way it used to. And then I watched him catch himself. I watched a 6-year-old physically remember that he was supposed to be afraid of me, and pull the light back off his own face and turn away again. Somebody had taught my baby to be ashamed of loving me. I kept my voice steady for the rest of that hour, and I cried the whole drive home. But here's what I did, and I want to say this to anyone out there in a version of my situation because it's the only advice I have and it turned out to be everything. I kept every record, not to be cold, because my lawyer told me to and because some instinct told me that the truth was the only weapon I had that couldn't be taken from me. Every canceled visit I documented, the date, the reason she gave, the text where she called it off an hour before. Every call that went to voicemail the phone logged. And the letters. I still had proof of the letters. Because here's what I'd found out. When I got home and started trying to reach my kids, I asked Sadie once, carefully, if she'd gotten my letters, and she looked at me like I was speaking a language she didn't know. "You didn't write us any letters," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact she'd been given. And that's when I understood that every letter I'd mailed home for 9 months had never reached my children's hands. I'd sent a lot of them certified near the end, because the regular ones felt like they were vanishing and some worried part of me wanted a receipt. And certified mail, when it's refused or returned, comes back to you. I had a box of them. A literal box in my rented room of letters I'd written to Sadie and Micah, addressed in my handwriting, stamped and dated from overseas, returned, unopened, refused. 9 months of a father telling his kids he loved them and missed them and was coming home, that they never saw, that came back to me sealed. I remember the day the certified ones started coming back. I was already home by then, in my rented room, still trying to figure out what had happened to my family, and the mail came, and there were 3 of my own envelopes in it, addressed in my own handwriting to Sadie and to Micah, stamped from overseas, and across the front, a sticker. Refused. Returned to sender. I stood in the doorway of that little room, holding letters I'd written to my children on the other side of the world, that had traveled all that way there and all the way back, and had never once been opened by the people whose names were on them. And then more came, and more, until I had a shoebox full of them. I never threw them away. I don't fully know why at the time. It just felt wrong to throw away a thing I'd written to my kids. So I kept the box on a shelf, and every time I looked at it, I felt sick, and I could not have told you that it would one day be the most important thing I owned. That box is what the judge would open in that courtroom. Well, the record of it. Let me get to the courtroom. By the time we got to that final hearing, Corinne was confident, and I understand why. She had the money now, Blaine's money and Blaine's lawyer, a slick one. She had the kids living in a big house and saying they didn't want to see me, and they did say that because they'd been taught to. She had her mother ready to testify about what a deadbeat I was, and she had the story, the clean story she'd been building for a year, that I abandoned my family, chose to disappear overseas, never contacted my children, and only came crawling back when it was convenient. On its surface, to a stranger, it held together. That's what she was counting on. And she got up on the stand under oath, and she told it. She testified that I had left the family, that during those 9 months I had made no meaningful effort to contact the children, that I had not written, had not called in any consistent way, had shown no interest, that the children were frightened of me and did not wish to see me. She said it clearly and calmly, and her lawyer nodded along. And across the room my son looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked me if I'd stopped loving them, because the woman on that stand was his mother and he believed her. Every single thing she said under oath was a lie, and I could prove it. And she did not know that I could. That's the thing she'd gotten wrong. In building her story, she'd assumed my absence had left no trace, that a man 10,000 miles away leaves no record of trying. But I hadn't been absent. I'd been blocked. And blocked is different from absent, because blocking leaves fingerprints. Every returned letter, every ignored call, every canceled visit, those weren't evidence that I'd disappeared. They were evidence that I'd been reaching, over and over, and being stopped. The very completeness of her wall was the proof it existed. Here is what actually happened when the judge opened that envelope, and I want to tell it to you straight, because it was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no shouting. The judge did not bang a gavel. What happened was quieter than that, and worse for them, because a calm judge who has just caught you is far more frightening than an angry one. There had been a court-appointed advocate for the children, a guardian ad litem, a person whose only job is to investigate what's actually best for the kids, independent of both parents, and to tell the court the truth as she found it. I didn't fully understand, when she was appointed, how much that one person would matter. She spent weeks on it. She sat with Sadie and Micah separately, more than once, in a quiet room, and she listened not just to what they said, but to how they said it. And she told me later that it took her about 10 minutes with my son to know that something was wrong, because a child who has genuinely been hurt or neglected talks about it one way, and a child who has been coached talks about it another way, and she'd done this long enough to hear the difference. Micah kept using words that weren't a 6-year-old's words. He told her his father had chosen his own life over the family. 6-year-olds don't say that. Somebody had handed him that sentence, and she knew it. She interviewed the teachers who remembered a dad at soccer games and school pickups before the trip. She looked at the phone logs and the mail. And slowly, carefully, she built the real picture. And my lawyer had submitted our evidence to the court in advance: the phone logs, the documented canceled visits, and photographs and the certified mail records of every returned letter. All of it was in a sealed packet with the Guardian's report, and the judge had it on the bench in an envelope. And after Corinne finished testifying that I'd never tried to reach my children, the judge opened it. He read for a while. The room was silent. He looked at the phone logs. He looked at the mail records. 9 months of certified letters, sent from overseas in my name, everyone returned unopened and refused, with dates that lined up exactly against the months Corinne had just sworn I'd made no effort. He looked at the Guardian ad litem's report, which I would learn concluded, in careful professional language, that the children had been deliberately turned against their father, and that the account one parent had given did not match the evidence. And then the judge set it down, and he looked at my wife and he said, very quietly, "Miss Corrigan, I've just reviewed a box of letters your husband mailed to these children from overseas, refused and returned to sender. Dated across the exact period you've just testified he made no contact." He let that sit for a second. "I want to give you the opportunity to revise your testimony, because right now it does not match what's in front of me, and you're under oath." That was the moment. Not a laugh, not a gotcha. Just a calm man with the truth in his hands, giving her one chance, and the whole room understanding at once what it meant. Blaine's expensive smirk was gone. Her mother had stopped smiling, and Corinne opened her mouth and closed it because there was no revision to make. You cannot explain away a box of returned letters. They are what they are. She tried, for a second. She started to say something about how she couldn't have known the children would want them, and even as she said it, you could hear it fall apart, because a moment earlier she'd sworn I never sent anything at all, and now she was explaining why she'd refused the things I never sent. Her own lawyer put a hand on her arm to stop her. That's how I knew it was over. When her own lawyer stopped her from talking. Her mother, who an hour before had smiled at me and said I didn't deserve to be called Dad, would not look at me now. And Blaine, the man with the money and the smirk, did the thing that told me exactly what he was. He leaned away from Corinne. Physically. Put a few inches of bench between himself and the woman he'd helped do this, now that it was going badly. Money like his doesn't stay in a sinking boat. I'm not going to walk you through every legal step that followed, because these things grind on for months and the details would fill an hour. But I'll tell you what mattered. The judge found that Corinne had deliberately alienated the children from me, that she had blocked my contact, hidden my letters, and taught 2 small kids to believe their father had abandoned them, and that she had then lied about all of it under oath. And that finding changed everything, because a family court's entire job is the best interest of the children, and a parent who will lie to a court and weaponize her own kids against a loving father has just told that court a great deal about her judgment. The custody she was so sure she'd won did not go the way she'd planned. It reversed. My children came home to me as their primary parent, with their mother's role structured carefully, and supervised at first, until the damage she'd done could be understood and undone with help. But understand this. The courtroom is not the part of this story that matters to me. The verdict gave me my kids back on paper. It did not give me back the thing she'd actually taken, which was my children believing I loved them. Paper can't fix that. Only one thing could. The letters. I still had the box. And a few weeks after everything settled, when Micah and Sadie were living with me and we were all raw and careful and learning each other again, I sat my 2 kids down on the floor of our new place, and I put the box between us, and I told them the truth in the only way that couldn't be argued with. I told them that while I was away, I had written them a letter every single week the whole time I was gone, that I had never once stopped thinking about them, and that they'd never gotten the letters, and that wasn't their fault, and I wasn't going to explain whose fault it was, but that the letters were real, and here they were, and they could read every one. And I opened the box and I let my daughter and my son see 9 months of their father's handwriting with their own names on the front. Dozens of envelopes, all addressed to them. All dated from when they thought I'd forgotten them. I'd forgotten what was even in most of them. So we found out together. They were nothing special, that's the thing. They weren't grand. They were a dad telling his kids that it was so hot he saw a bird standing in the shade of a truck tire, that he'd counted, and there were 19 more Fridays until he was home, then 18, then 17. That he hoped Sadie's team won, and that Micah was being brave at the dentist. Ordinary letters. That's what she'd kept from them, not some dramatic declaration, just the small, steady, ordinary proof that their father was thinking about them every single week he was gone, which is, when you're a kid, the only proof that actually matters. Sadie went. Very quiet. She's 9, and 9 is old enough to understand what a box like that means, and I watched her do the math. I watched her understand that every week she'd been told her dad didn't care. Her dad had been sitting in a desert camp writing her name on an envelope. She didn't say anything. She just started opening them, one after another, reading them in order, and about halfway through the box she climbed into my lap the way she hadn't since she was small, and she cried, and I held her. And Micah, my little boy, who'd asked me in that courtroom if I'd stopped loving them. Micah couldn't read most of it yet, he's 6, so he brought me the letters one at a time and had me read them to him. My own words, written to him from the far side of the earth, read out loud to him in my own voice, finally, months late. And somewhere in the stack he stopped me, and he put his small hand flat on the page, and he said, "You wrote this before, when you were gone?" And I said yes. Every week. And he thought about that with the whole seriousness a 6-year-old can muster. And then he said, "So you didn't stop?" And I said, "No, buddy, I never stopped. Not for one single day." He nodded, slow, like a small man accepting a serious fact, and then he asked if he could keep the letters in his room. And I said they were his, they'd always been his, and he carried the whole box off to his new bedroom like it was treasure. He still has them. Sometimes I find one under his pillow. That's the moment I'd fought a year for. Not the verdict, that. The recovery wasn't a switch that flipped, and I don't want to pretend it was. There was a night, a couple of months in, when Sadie, who'd read every letter, who knew the truth now, got angry at me over something small, bedtime probably, and the real thing underneath came out sideways the way it does with kids, and she screamed that maybe I did leave, maybe it was my fault. Maybe if I'd stayed, none of it would have happened. And the terrible part is that there's a sliver of truth in it. I did go, even for good reasons, and my going is the door the whole thing walked through. I didn't defend myself. I just held her while she was furious, and I told her she was allowed to be angry that I left, and that both things could be true, that I went because I loved them, and that it still cost them something I could never fully give back. She fell asleep against me, still hiccuping. We had a lot of nights like that. We still have some. Healing a kid isn't a verdict. It's 1,000 ordinary nights. I'll tell you where we are now. My kids live with me and they're okay. Better than okay, mostly. Though a thing like that leaves marks, and we still hit hard days. Corinne is in their lives because I made a decision that I think is the most important one in this whole story, and I want to leave you with it. I chose not to do to her what she did to me. It would have been easy. I had every reason, and the kids would have believed me now, the way they'd believed her before. I could have spent the next 10 years teaching them to hate their mother, and it would have worked. I didn't. Because the whole crime, the thing that nearly destroyed my children, was a parent using a child's love as a weapon against the other parent. And if I turned around and did the same thing back, then I hadn't learned anything. and my kids would just be a battlefield with a different flag over it. They don't need to hate their mother. They need to grow up whole. So I tell them the truth when they ask, and I don't add poison to it, and I let them love her, because a kid deserves to love both parents, even when one of them didn't deserve it. Especially then, maybe. That part's not for her, it's for them. Let me leave you with one question, and I really do read these, so tell me. Has anyone ever told a lie about you to someone you loved? And did you ever get the chance to show them the truth? What happened when you did? I'd genuinely like to know. Because I learned that a lie can live only as long as the truth stays hidden, and that sometimes the truth is sitting in a box you couldn't bring yourself to throw away. And if this story meant something to you, do me one small kindness before you go. Leave a comment, even a single word, so I know you stayed with us to the end. And subscribe so the next story finds you when it comes. Because they keep coming. And sometimes the most important thing a father ever says to his son is just 3 words: I never stopped.